The train arrived with a great sigh of steam and steel, a tired beast come to rest in the heart of a sun-scorched town. Amos Hewitt stood on the wooden platform, his shadow long and thin in the late afternoon light. He'd been a solitary man for 3 hard years, his world shrinking to the size of his ranch and the silence within his own mind. He had sent away for a bride, a practical decision born of lonely nights and fences that needed more than one pair of hands to mend. The advertisement had been specific: a plain woman, hard-working, of good character, seeking a quiet life. He wasn't looking for love, not again. He was looking for a partner, someone to share the crushing weight of the work, to make his empty house feel less like a tomb. He expected a woman with tired eyes and sturdy hands, someone who understood that survival was a chore, not a romance. The passengers began to disembark, a slow trickle of dusty travelers and weary families. He scanned the faces, searching for the one he imagined. But then a figure appeared in the doorway of the passenger car, and the entire platform seemed to hold its breath. It was a woman, but not the one from his imagination. She was dressed in black from head to toe, a black duster that fell to her ankles, black trousers tucked into scuffed leather boots, and a wide-brimmed black hat that shadowed a face of impossible beauty. Her skin was like porcelain, her eyes dark and sharp, missing nothing. She moved with a liquid grace that was both elegant and dangerous, her posture straight, her chin high. A pistol with an aged wooden grip was holstered low on her hip, tied down against her thigh. The whispers started immediately, a ripple of shock and suspicion spreading through the small crowd. This was not a farmer's wife. This was an apparition, a specter from a dime novel, and she had just stepped into their world. Amos felt a knot tighten in his gut. This had to be a mistake. He took a half step forward as she descended the steps, her gaze sweeping over the gawking townspeople before landing on him. Her eyes held his, and for a moment he felt like the one being appraised, weighed, and measured. She walked toward him, her steps silent and deliberate, the jingle of her spurs the only sound in the sudden quiet. "I was expecting someone else," Amos said, his voice rougher than he intended. The woman stopped before him, her expression unreadable. "I am the one who answered the advertisement," she said. Her voice was calm, clear, with an accent he couldn't quite place, a melody layered over steel. "Are you Mr. Hewitt?" He could only nod, his mind racing. He had sent for a helper. He had invited a storm. The walk from the station was a gauntlet of silent judgment. Every window seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes, every doorway a hushed conversation that died as they passed. Amos was a man who valued his privacy, who had earned a quiet, if lonely, respect in this town through sheer hard work. Now, walking beside this woman, he felt like a spectacle. He was acutely aware of the gun at her hip, of the confident, predatory way she moved, so at odds with the demure, hard-working widow he had paid to bring here. He had 100 questions, but the most pressing one was simple. What kind of trouble had he just invited into his life? His ranch was failing, worn down by drought and his own grief. He couldn't afford to send her back, not with the last of his savings spent on her ticket. He was trapped by his own desperate, practical decision. He stopped beside his small buckboard, the wood weathered and gray. He turned to face her, his expression grim. "The letter said you were a widow, said you were good with chores, knew how to keep a house." Her dark eyes met his, and there was not a flicker of apology or deception in them. "I can work," she stated, her tone even. "I can keep a house." Her hand drifted down, not to touch the pistol, but to simply rest near it, a gesture that was both unconscious and deeply meaningful. "And I can handle trouble." It wasn't a boast, it was a fact, delivered with the same quiet certainty one might use to say they could bake bread. Amos looked from her face to the pistol, then back again. Trouble was the one thing he had in surplus. He didn't need more of it. But as he looked at her, standing tall and unbowed under the weight of the town's scorn, he saw something else. Strength. A resilience that mirrored the harsh landscape around them. They arrived at his ranch as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the dusty plains in hues of orange and purple. The house was small, sturdy, built of timber he had cut himself. It was a lonely outpost against the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the territory. She took it all in. The neglected porch, the dry patch of ground where a garden had once been, the endless sky overhead. He saw her shoulders relax, just a fraction, as if the isolation was a comfort, not a threat. He pulled the buckboard to a halt and sat for a long moment, the reins loose in his hands. He had made a bargain, and he was a man who honored his word, even if the terms had changed so drastically. "The deal was for a wife," he said, not looking at her. "A partner. You stay, you work. No questions from me, no trouble from you. We get married tomorrow. Is that understood?" He finally turned to her. She looked at the house, her future, and then back at him. She gave a single, sharp nod. The agreement was sealed, not with a handshake, but with a shared understanding of desperation. The wedding, if it could be called that, was a 5-minute affair in the dusty office of the Justice of the Peace. The man, a portly official named Judge Miller, peered at them over his spectacles, his disapproval a palpable force in the small room. Amos stood stiffly in his cleanest shirt, and the woman, whose name he still hadn't asked, stood beside him, silent and still in her dark attire. When Miller asked for her name for the certificate, she paused for a beat too long. "Lynn," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Just Lynn." Miller wrote it down with a scratch of his pen, his lips pursed. He rushed through the words, eager to be done with the strange union. As they were pronounced man and wife, there was no kiss, no embrace, just a quiet, awkward exchange of glances before Amos paid the fee and led his new wife out into the harsh sunlight. The town now had official reason to whisper. Amos Hewitt had married the mysterious woman in black. Back at the ranch, a new and uncomfortable reality set in. They were strangers, bound by a legal document and a shared roof. She moved into the small spare room at the back of the house without a word of complaint, her few belongings contained in a single well-worn saddlebag. The first few days passed in a haze of strained silence, the air thick with unspoken things. But Lynn, as she had promised, was a worker. She rose before the sun, the smell of coffee and frying bacon greeting Amos when he came in from the barn. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, mended the tears in his work shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches, and attacked the neglected garden plot with a ferocity that surprised him. She moved with a quiet, relentless efficiency, transforming the sterile house into a home little by little. She cleaned the years of grime from the kitchen window, and when the morning sun streamed in, it illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, making the small space feel brighter, warmer. Amos noticed. He noticed everything. He watched her from the corner of his eye, this enigma who could handle a branding iron as easily as a needle and thread, who never spoke of her past, whose eyes were always scanning the horizon as if expecting an enemy to appear. He had expected a plain bride. He had gotten a silent, vigilant guardian. One afternoon, Amos was a mile out, mending a stretch of fence that had been trampled by wild horses. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the work was slow and hard. He was so focused on stretching the wire taut that he didn't notice the rider approaching his property until he was on his way back. He saw the fresh hoof prints near the house, and his hand instinctively went GK on his hip. He found Lynn on the porch, calmly sweeping away dust that wasn't there. The air around her was still and charged, like the moment after a lightning strike. He looked at the tracks, then at her. "Someone was here," he said, his voice flat. She GK stopped sweeping. She just nodded toward the road. "A man from the Miller Ranch. He was drunk." Her voice was devoid of emotion. "He won't be back." Amos didn't need to ask what had happened. He could imagine it clearly. The drunken swagger, the crude words, and then the sudden, shocking appearance of the pistol in her hand. He could see the fear in the man's eyes as he realized his mistake. He looked at Lynn, her GK frame belying the immense danger she carried so casually. She had defended herself, but in doing so, she had also defended his home, his property. She had stood her ground on his land, for him. It was a turning point, a subtle shift GK of their strange arrangement. He was beginning to see that the gun on her hip wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. A promise that she could take care of herself, and perhaps take care of him too. That evening, when he came inside, he unbuckled his own GK belt and hung it on a peg by the door for the first time in years. It was a small gesture, but it was an answer to the one she had made on the porch. It was a sign of trust. He was starting to realize that the safety of his home no longer rested solely on his own shoulders. He had a partner, a silent, watchful, and deadly partner. And for the first time since his first wife had passed, he didn't feel entirely alone, GK. Weeks turned into a month, and the blistering heat of summer settled over the valley. A rhythm formed between them, a pattern of shared labor and comfortable silence. He would work the ranch, and she would manage the house and garden, her efforts bringing forth rows of stubborn vegetables from the dry soil. They ate their meals together at the small wooden table, the scrape of forks on plates often the only sound. Yet the silence was no longer strained. It had become a language of its own, a space where they could exist without the need for pretense. He learned her habits, the way she would pause her work to watch the hawks circling high overhead, the faint, almost imperceptible hum that escaped her lips when she was kneading dough. She learned his, the deep weariness in his shoulders after a long day, the way he would run a hand over his jaw when he was thinking, the quiet sorrow that still lived in his eyes. They were two solitary people orbiting each other, their paths slowly, inevitably drawing closer. One evening, a summer storm rolled in with unexpected fury. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled around the small house, rattling the windows in their frames. Rain lashed against the roof in a relentless torrent. The storm trapped them inside, forcing them into a proximity that their daily chores usually allowed them to avoid. The fire in the hearth crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Amos sat in his chair, oiling a piece of leather tack, while Lynn sat across from him, mending one of his shirts by the firelight. The needle moved in and out of the fabric with hypnotic precision. As she reached for her sewing basket, her sleeve slid back, revealing a pale, thin scar that circled her wrist like a delicate, broken bracelet. Amos saw it and his hands stilled. He had 1,000 questions, but he knew she wouldn't answer them. So he did something else. He offered a piece of himself. "Martha," he said, his voice quiet, barely a whisper above the storm. "My first wife. She loved the wildflowers that grow up on the ridge in the spring. Said they were God's own embroidery on the land." It was the first time he had spoken her name to Lynn. It was a small, fragile offering of his own story, his own grief. Lynn's hands stopped moving. She looked up from her sewing, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. She listened, truly listened, as he spoke a few more simple sentences about a woman she would never know. When he fell silent, the only sounds were the fire and the raging storm. Then she spoke, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "It is good to remember the beautiful things." The words were simple, yet they landed in the quiet room with profound weight. It was an acknowledgment of his pain and, perhaps, a hint of her own. The wall between them, built of secrets and silence, had just begun to crumble. It's hard to know what to make of a woman like that, isn't it? A woman who can handle a gun better than most men, but speaks of beautiful things. She's a mystery wrapped in black cloth, a danger and a comfort all at once. What do you think Amos should do? Should he press her for the truth, or continue to trust the partner she has shown herself to be? Let me know your thoughts down below, and we'll get back to the story. The next trip into town was a necessity. Supplies were low, and Amos needed to speak with the blacksmith about a broken plow. Lynn came with him, her presence at his side now a familiar, if still startling, sight for the townspeople. They had moved from open gawking to a sort of grudging acceptance. The woman worked hard, kept to herself, and hadn't brought any apparent trouble. They were in the general store, the air thick with the scent of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples, when the bell above the door chimed. 2 men entered, dressed in city clothes that looked out of place in the dusty town. They were followed by a third man, tall and imperious, in a fine wool suit despite the heat. His face was cruel and handsome, his eyes cold chips of obsidian. As his gaze swept the store, it fell upon Lynn. His expression shifted from mild annoyance to sharp, predatory recognition. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his lips. "Well, well," the man said, his voice a low purr that cut through the store's quiet murmur. "Look what the dust blew in. I've been looking for you for a long time, little bird." Lynn froze. All the color drained from her face, and her body went rigid. The calm, unshakable woman Amos had come to know was gone, replaced by someone who looked haunted, cornered. The store fell silent. Everyone turned to watch. Amos saw the raw fear in Lynn's eyes, and a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed surged through him. He put down the sack of flour he was holding and stepped deliberately between Lynn and the stranger, shielding her with his body. He was just a farmer, a big man hardened by labor, but he stood his ground. "She's my wife," Amos said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He had never said the words with such conviction. "And she's not going anywhere with you." The man, who carried himself with an air of absolute authority, let out a short, humorless laugh. "Wife?" he sneered, looking Amos up and down with open contempt. "You married this? You have no idea what you've brought into your home, farmer." He leaned to the side, his cold eyes finding Lynn again. "The debt is not paid, my dear. It is never paid." He straightened his coat, gave a curt nod to his men, and turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back, his gaze locking onto Amos. "Enjoy your time with her. It will be short." Then he was gone, leaving a trail of menace that hung in the air like poison. The ride back to the ranch was suffocatingly silent. The threat from the man in the suit, a man Amos now knew was named Sterling, lay between them like a physical weight. Amos didn't push, didn't demand answers. He simply drove, his jaw tight, his knuckles white on the reins. He waited. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the time for secrets was over. When they reached the house, the sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like grasping fingers. Lynn went inside and moved straight to the kitchen. Amos followed, watching as she stood by the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. For a long time she said nothing. Then she turned, and the story that she had held captive for so long finally broke free. Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity, as she spoke of a life in a city he could barely imagine. Her father had been a merchant, a good man with a weakness for gambling. He had fallen into debt to Mr. Sterling, a man who ran the city's criminal underworld with an iron fist. When her father couldn't pay, Sterling had taken her as collateral. She wasn't his wife or his lover. She was his property, his enforcer. He had discovered her uncanny skill with a pistol and had used it for his own violent ends. She was forced to collect his debts, to intimidate his enemies, to become the feared specter known only as the Lady in Black. She had done it to protect her father, but Sterling's cruelty knew no bounds. He had her father killed anyway, a final, brutal lesson in ownership. That was when she ran. She fled with nothing but the clothes on her back and the gun on her hip, seeking a place so remote, so quiet, that he would never find her. Answering a mail-order bride advertisement from a lonely farmer in the middle of nowhere had seemed like the perfect disguise. "My name is Lynn," she finished, her voice finally trembling. "I am not the widow from the letter. I am a killer. I ran because he would never let me go." She unbuckled her gun belt and laid it on the kitchen table between them. The metal of the buckle made a soft, final clink against the wood. "I brought this trouble to your door. You should send me away." She stood before him, stripped of her secrets, expecting his judgment, his fear, his rejection. Amos looked at the gun, the tool of her dark past. Then he looked at her face, her beautiful, proud face, now awash with a vulnerability he had never seen. He thought of his clean floors, his mended shirts, his thriving garden, the way she had faced down the drunk on his porch. "You defended this home," he said, his voice steady and sure. "You've worked this land with me. You've been a better partner than I had any right to ask for." He reached out and pushed the gun belt back across the table toward her. "Your name is Lynn Hewitt, and this is your home. He'll have to come through me to get to you." Her eyes widened, glistening with unshed tears. He tapped the pistol with his finger. "You might need this." They didn't have to wait long. 3 nights later, under the sliver of a pale moon, they came. Amos saw them first, 3 riders approaching the house, their forms dark against the silvered landscape. There was no pretense of a social call. These were hunters, and he and Lynn were the prey. "They're here," he said, his voice grim as he barred the door. Lynn was already moving, her actions fluid and economical. She checked her pistol, grabbed the rifle from its place above the mantel, and handed it to him along with a box of cartridges. Her face was a mask of calm focus, the fear he had seen in town replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Stay away from the windows," she instructed, her voice low and clear. "They'll try to draw our fire. Don't shoot until you have a clean target." He nodded, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He was a farmer, not a fighter, but tonight he would fight for his home. for her. The first shot shattered the kitchen window, spraying glass across the floor. The siege had begun. What followed was a terrifying symphony of chaos. The sharp crack of rifles, the splintering of wood, the whizzing of bullets that seemed to come from all directions. Through it all, Lynn was an island of deadly calm. She moved through the darkened house like a phantom, a whisper of black cloth and controlled violence. "There's one by the corner of the barn," she would murmur, and Amos would fire his rifle where she indicated. "Reload," she'd command, and he would fumble with the cartridges, his clumsy fingers feeling slow and useless compared to her grace. He wasn't just following orders, he was trusting her with his life. He saw her in flashes, illuminated by the muzzle flare of her pistol, her eyes narrowed in concentration, her body a study in lethal efficiency. This was the woman Sterling had created, the outlaw, the killer. But as she fought to protect their small, shared world, Amos saw something else entirely. He saw a fierce, magnificent protector. In a brief lull in the gunfire, as they crouched below the shattered window, their eyes met across the dark room. In that shared glance there was fear, yes, but there was also something more profound, an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond being forged between them in the heat of battle. He reached out, his calloused hand briefly covering hers where she gripped the rifle stock. It was a simple touch, a promise of solidarity. "We'll see the sunrise," he said, his voice a rough whisper. It was not a prediction, it was a vow. The fight ended as dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of gray and pink. Sterling, having lost 2 of his men and underestimating the ferocity of their defense, finally retreated, his parting shots fading into the distance. The immediate danger was over. Silence descended upon the ranch, a silence that felt heavy and sacred. The house was a wreck, the walls pockmarked with bullet holes, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder. But it was still standing. They were still standing. Amos leaned against the wall, a searing pain in his left arm making him grit his teeth. A bullet had grazed him, tearing through his sleeve and flesh. Lynn was at his side in an instant, her calm focus shifting from the fight to him. She gently tore away the ruined fabric, her expression softening with concern as she examined the wound. She led him to the kitchen and made him sit, her touch surprisingly gentle as she cleaned the wound with whiskey and bandaged it with clean strips of cloth. The adrenaline of the battle faded, leaving behind a raw, trembling exhaustion and something else, something new and fragile that had taken root in the violent night. The physical and emotional distance that had always existed between them had been burned away. He looked at her, truly looked at her as she worked, her face smudged with soot, her dark hair coming loose from its braid. He saw the outlaw and the homemaker, the killer and the protector, all in one person. He saw the woman who had answered his advertisement for a plain wife and had given him more than he ever could have imagined. "You were right," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You can handle trouble." She looked up from tying the bandage, her dark eyes meeting his. A small, weary smile touched her lips. "We handled it," she corrected him softly. "Together." He reached up with his good hand, his thumb gently brushing a smudge from her cheek. The gesture was tender, reverent. The space between them hummed with unspoken feelings. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she didn't. He pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but one of profound gratitude, of shared survival, of a deep and quiet promise. It was the real beginning of their marriage. In the weeks that followed, a new kind of life began on the Hewitt Ranch. They worked side by side to repair the damage, patching the bullet holes in the walls, replacing the shattered window, mending the broken fences. The shared labor was a balm, a way of physically rebuilding their home, while they emotionally rebuilt their lives. The town buzzed with the story of the shootout. The tale grew with each telling, painting Amos and his mysterious wife as frontier legends who had stood against a city gangster and won. The whispers of suspicion were replaced by murmurs of awe and respect. When they went into town now, people nodded to them. The women would offer Lynn a hesitant smile, and the men would look at Amos with a newfound admiration. They were no longer the town's strange spectacle. They were a part of its fabric, a testament to the fact that strength could be found in the most unlikely of partnerships. The biggest change, however, was in the small house on the plains. Laughter, a sound Amos hadn't truly heard in years, began to fill the quiet spaces. It started small, a chuckle over a spilled bucket of milk, a shared smile at the antics of a prairie dog. Lynn's gun belt no longer stayed on her hip from sunup to sundown. It now hung on a peg inside the door, a tool ready if needed, but no longer a piece of her daily identity. The constant watchfulness in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a soft, settled calm. She smiled more often, real, genuine smiles that lit up her entire face and made Amos's heart feel impossibly full. He had sent for a plain, hard-working woman to ease his burden. He had not expected a beautiful, dangerous protector who would stand with him against the world, who would teach him that home wasn't just a structure of wood and nails, but something you built with another person, through shared work and shared silence and shared danger. One evening, they stood on the porch, watching the sun set over their land. The world was vast and quiet, the air cool and sweet. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture that spoke volumes. He had expected a housekeeper. He had found a queen. She had been looking for a place to hide. She had found a place to belong. Together, they looked out at the horizon, at the future stretching before them. No longer a lonely, uncertain path, but a shared journey, as clear and bright as the coming stars.